All right, so as we kind of round out the rest of this lecture here by taking kind of a summary or a cursory look at the remaining areas of the world here at 1450, primarily the African kingdoms, empires, and the trade routes that were trade ties that were established, and also the people and empires of the Americas as well. Uh, it's important to note that there were numerous centers of power on the African continent, which is during the same period of time leading up to about 1450, which is quite similar to, in many respects, to Europe, in that you had kind of this close, densely compacted states that were, had in close proximity to one another. The difference between that and the African situation is that Africa is more expansive as far as land and territory is concerned, and so therefore there were numerous centers of influence in Africa, but they were just spread out a little bit more broadly than in Europe. One of the most distinguished of these, and there are several, but one of the most distinguished of these is the Mali Empire. At its height, they enjoyed a tremendous amount of wealth and prestige. They benefited from ample resources, especially the commodity of gold. One source mentions that leaders of this empire, again, when it was at its height, were among the richest individuals in the known world in all of human history. And that kind of characteristic is going to attract quite a bit of attention. And one of the first populations, outside populations, to take note was that of the Muslim traders moving south along trade routes from North Africa into the transiting the Saharan desert into the interior of the continent itself. So traders were able to establish these routes through the Sahara, and they profited mightily from the wealth and commodities, the valuables that were coming from Africa, from places like the Mali Empire, places like Timbuktu and Gao, as well as other settled and established not only population centers but also centralized states as well. This led to efforts by both Muslim traders but also Europeans to establish and impose direct intervention and kind of an expansionist agenda over into these regions and over those people living in those areas. I think your textbook mentions, and I should actually, as a side note, page 454 of your textbook offers a fantastic map of the African continent, the centers of influence and power in the Sahel region of Africa that include the likes of the Mali Empire, and also the trade routes along and across the Sahara Desert from North Africa, as well as the explorations, the European, primarily Portuguese, initially explorations of the western coastline of the African continent as well. So just as a reference, as a guide, you might want to take a look at that. Your textbook mentions that the Moroccans actually organized an army, sent it south along these trade routes in an effort not only to secure the routes of trade, but also to actually control and secure the sources of this wealth and the gold mines that were, creating all of this profit. So it was not necessarily successful. Those initial efforts were not necessarily successful, but by the 15th century, as Europe begins to rehabilitate itself and recover from the bubonic plague, Portugal is going to begin that process of systematic exploration and, along with it, exploitation of the West African coast and the populations living there. And we'll be getting into that in greater detail next week, in week 2. Proceeding across the Atlantic to the Americas, which at the time were not named that, but for lack of a better description, your textbook Patterns of World History provides a detailed history of Mesoamerica and also South America and the developments taking place there. That's in chapter 15, one of the 2 assigned chapters for this week, chapters 15 and 16. So it does an excellent job of describing the development of civilization among those in that region, among those populations. It's interesting to note that the key characteristics of expansion and development reflect the global trends that we've been tracing here over the course of this single lecture. That you see a distinct progression or shift from the Wari and Toltec groups, these kind of maybe more smaller, in the case of the Toltec, to a more extensive or expansive Wari presence in South America, to say the Mayan settlements and civilization, where there's a moderate trend towards centralization, but it's over a large expansive area of the Yucatan Peninsula and beyond, to, at the extreme, the highly organized and dominant presence of the Aztec and Incan civilizations and empires that were present at the time of first contact with the the arrival of a European presence. So in this region of the world, there's this same tendency and the exhibition of these same characteristics towards greater centralization, efficiency, and administration and organization that makes it for the physical growth of empires to take place. But this happens devoid of any contact with the outside world and the world network as a whole. So as if it's only kind of a human trend to go through this process of and these kinds of trials and errors, you might say, of expansion. Keep this concept in mind, and of course this is not a law or rule by any means. It is debatable, but keep this concept in mind as you progress through this week's readings and video content, and through our class as a whole, because you may be asked to discuss this aspect as we expand our scope moving forward into week 2, and we begin to draw comparisons and connections between these various groups across our planet, and try and identify any type of parallels or common characteristics. So just again, something to keep in mind. To wrap things up, however, because it is getting on as far as time is concerned, reaching the end here of our 75 minutes, it may be interesting to note the varying scope of expansion around the world here by the year 1450 or so. That whether it be regional in orientation or more kind of global in aspiration or ambition, that there's this impetus, this drive to move in a kind of expansionist mindset. It's also important to note that this is by no means guaranteed, and the presentation, the documentary / biography on Zheng He that is on Blackboard is a perfect example of this. That in the Chinese experience under the Ming Dynasty, you have this example of expansion and contraction, so that there is not a fixed kind of progressive process to these competing tendencies. That, by the year 1400, you have Zheng He at the head of an armada of Chinese vessels that has traversed through the Malacca Straits into the Indian Ocean, made contact with various populations, even as far afield as the Horn of Africa and what is today Zimbabwe, along the eastern coast of Africa, extracting tribute, negotiating trade deals, exerting a presence in this kind of global presence, and yet 30 years later, that is extinguished. That ocean-going vessels are not only burned, the ones that exist, but also outlawed from future construction. That China decides to turn inward and focus on its internal development rather than engaging in the world as a whole. It's also important to note how populations deal with domestic issues in addition to outside or foreign issues. That every society has to manage these two competing factors, and each in their own way is going to manage those differently, maybe at different times, but that there is perhaps some common elements that we can identify. One of the best examples is that and how each reacts to these pressures. As an example, Europe and its experience with suffering from the bubonic plague is creating tremendous stress, social, economic, cultural, in all these different areas. But there's a sense of resilience that is going to permeate that period of time as well. And the same can be said for groups under the influence or authority of others. That identity and tradition, culture, in some cases religion, language, all these markers that identify a population are extremely resilient. And that seems to be again, kind of a human quality or characteristic that you can see and directly point to time and time again around the world in all these various examples. So that's another kind of theme that may be important to keep in your mind as you go through all of this material. So hopefully that is helpful as far as kind of giving us an idea as to where the world stood as we begin to plunge into the heart of this timeline for our course. If you have any questions or concerns or what have you, please feel free to contact me via email, as mentioned in the previous presentation, the introduction. I will continue prepping the material for next week. As we move forward, we'll be looking at specifically the chapter 17 of your textbook, which is primarily focused on the Reformation developments in Europe, not to be extremely Western focused, but the developments in specifically the Reformation and the Renaissance that would come to define Europeans and their priorities as they became emerging players on the world stage. So bid you all adieu. Hope all is well, and I will pick up next week and look forward to reading your postings, kind of introducing yourself on Blackboard and moving forward. I think these 13 weeks are going to go by pretty fast, so get ready. Take care. See you.